Is stretching helpful? Yes, but not for these 5 reasons. Myth number 1, stretching makes muscles longer.
You are fake news. Go ahead.
Now, this statement made in absolution is not necessarily complete fact, but the general consensus to date in the scientific community is that stretching does not actually make a significant change in muscle length. Now, when we talk about muscles, we want to be talking about sarcomeres and fascicle length, right? So a sarcomere is essentially the smallest functional unit inside of a muscle that contracts. Now, think of it like if we think of a muscle like a gigantic elastic band, or let's say a chain of elastic bands. Each tiny little sarcomere would be one elastic band inside the gigantic chain, and there are up to 2,500 sarcomeres per square centimetre of muscle tissue, and therefore muscular adaptations are a result in part of sarcomere number and contractility. The more sarcomeres you have, the larger and stronger the muscle. And fascicle length is essentially the most commonly used metric in the research to define whether a muscle has increased in its length or not. So essentially we've got the muscle, and we've got the muscle for fascicles, divide down into muscle fibers, and so on and so forth, until you reach those smallest individual units, the sarcomeres. Now, this systematic review from 2018 combined the results of 26 relevant studies and concluded that stretching programs averaging 20 minutes per muscle per week had made no change in muscle or tendon properties within the first 8 weeks. If we average this out over 7 days, a typical person might be stretching for 3 minutes a day, 7 days a week to reach their 20 minutes. But again, this is per muscle. There are many different directions that we can stretch in. So if you were to stretch for 3 minutes per muscle per day for 8 weeks, you would still not have any change in the sarcomere structure or number, therefore making no adaptation to muscle physiology. Now, one very common critique of stretching experiments, stretching research, is that programs aren't intense enough, they aren't long enough, they aren't frequent enough, and that could all be true. In fact, I came across one high-intensity stretching program that did show some quite interesting outcomes for muscle fascicle length. In this high-intensity program, subjects stretched for 7.5 minutes straight. At every 90-second interval, they increased the intensity of the stretch to make sure it was at a maximum tolerable intensity, just short of pain. And they did this stretching per muscle on average 5 days a week for 10 weeks. And they were able to show a 13% increase in muscle fascicle length. Now, some problems with this study is it was only actually 5 people who participated in the program against 5 people who remained controls. So it's a very, very small sample size. And let's be real, how many of you out there are stretching to that particular program? No one. Very, very few people are going to be out there stretching for 7.5 minutes per muscle, per day, 5 days a week, for 10 weeks. It's just, it's not realistic. And this is why, generally speaking, the majority of the population is not going to lengthen their muscles via a typical stretching program unless they want to do it super intense for a long period of time, repeatedly. The funny part of this study is even the authors had to comment that essentially a typical strength training program of the same duration typically nets a 20 to 30% increase in fascicle length, where a stretching program of the same duration will only net you 10 to 15%. So why are people going out and doing so much stretching when strengthening alone can give you much greater results in terms of muscle length, and you get all the benefits of strength and activity? No reason.
You are fake news.
Myth number 2, stretching makes you more flexible. Well, essentially, if we go back to principle 1 and say that stretching has no effect on muscle length or muscle and tendon properties, then how could we possibly go and say that it's going to make you more flexible? I feel like this might be a confusion in terms of definition, possibly on my part, so feel free to comment and let me know your own individual take on definitions. But the research definitely suggests that range of motion does indeed increase after a stretching program. But for me, range of motion takes into account more than just flexibility. Flexibility is a subset of range of motion, right? So range of motion is passive, generally speaking, passively measured. It usually takes into account the muscles, the fascia, the ligaments, the tendons, the soft tissues, the nerves, and even the bones. The bony structure can differ from individual to individual, which can enhance your potential range of motion. Now, when people talk about flexibility, I would imagine that they are specifically referring to how well their muscles can contract and lengthen. Most often, people who are doing flexibility training have a focus on improving their muscles, and they're not thinking about the secondary passive structures improving alongside it. I mean, that is what happens, but people aren't generally thinking about that, I would imagine. So then if stretching has no impact on overall muscle length, why would we assume that the muscles are improving in their flexibility while we stretch? It doesn't happen. These improvements in range of motion are at the level of neural desensitization, right? So the way that I explain it in the clinic to clients is basically that stretching is effectively strangling the nervous system. It's strangling the nerves and their ability to respond and react to stretching stimulus. So if you stretch long enough, the nervous system calms down and doesn't have such a great intense reaction to the same amount of stretch over and over again. It's just a matter of repetition and adaptation, but it's not adaptation in the muscles, it's adaptation temporarily in the nervous system. So yes, stretching improves range of motion, but no, it does not improve muscle flexibility.
You are fake news.
Stretching myth number 3. Stretching improves my posture. Once again, we come back to the same underlying principle. If acute stretching programs of a typical realistic duration do not alter muscle and tendon properties, how is it supposed to alter your posture? The best way to alter your posture is to change your posture, not to stretch. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes of stretching at the end of your 8-hour day hunched over a desk is not enough to overcome that low-level stretch stimulus over a long duration. Right? This is why I can definitely agree with the idea that muscles can change their length in response to stretching. Yeah. But obviously it either takes very high level stretching stimulus for shorter durations of time, 8 minutes as per the previous experiment, or it takes low intensity stretch for really long durations of time, aka sitting hunched over at your desk for 7 hours, aka sitting on the couch playing video games for 7 hours. 5 minutes of stretching is not going to overcome that. Change your posture. That will change your posture. Stretching improves stretching, not posture.
You are fake news.
Stretching myth number 4. Stretching helps my sore muscles. This 2018 review looked at 99 studies measuring the effectiveness of different interventions post-workout to reduce muscle damage and soreness, and found that several methods showed real promise. Unfortunately, stretching was not one of them. This 2011 study of over 2,300 participants found on average that stretching before, stretching after, or stretching before and after exercise reduced soreness by less than 1%, less than 1 point on a 100-point scale. And therefore the researchers had to conclude that no stretching regimen has a clinically significant impact on muscle soreness. And this is because muscle soreness is related to muscle damage. Tiny levels of muscle damage is what we need for the muscle to adapt and go through strengthening, go through conditioning. The constant removal of damaged and weak tissue and the replacement of stronger, more mobile, more adaptable tissue.
You are fake news.
Finally, myth number 5. Stretching helps prevent injuries. Now, the research has struggled time and time again to point out this fact, to prove whether or not stretching definitively reduces or even increases risk or rate of injury. Now, to be fair, it is a really difficult variable to measure. There are so many factors that can contribute to why someone might suffer an injury. And typically most injuries are either from repetitive tasks, or they're from acute trauma, from falls, from unpredictable, unexpected events, and reacting to these events are typically how we injure ourselves, and those sorts of things just can't be accounted for with a stretching program. It's not quite the right variable to match with the right measure. All right, guys, there you have it. 5 myths about muscle stretching. No, stretching doesn't make your muscles longer. No, because it doesn't make your muscles longer, it doesn't make you more flexible. And no, it doesn't help with your posture. Not to the extent that you think it does. No, it doesn't make you less sore. No, it doesn't make you less or more likely to be injured. Maybe a little bit controversial, but I assure you that I am speaking mostly from the evidence. I definitely have a little bit of a pet peeve with the word stretching. I think in general it's given way too much credit for certain things that it can't actually deliver on. And I think the actual benefits of stretching are not the benefits that are most commonly talked about. There are some definite reasons why stretching is useful in a training or a health program. It's just not necessarily for the reasons that we all believe or that we all think about straight away.